This morning, I want us to focus in on another word in this verse, though, because this word is really helpful for us, not just in understanding the message of Micah, but kind of understanding the world that we live in right now. Micah says, "Who is a God like you, pardoning iniquity, passing over transgression, for the remnant of his inheritance?" When we think of that word remnant, we think of it in different ways. Maybe you think of leftovers. Right now, Mary Ann's out of town. She's out east with a bunch of her old friends from high school, and they're having a good time out there, but that means I'm home alone, just me and the dogs. And so last night, I did what any other self-respecting man would do when their wife is out of town. I ordered a pizza. And I got a large. And I got a meat lovers, because I can do what I want, because I'm on my own. And I got breadsticks. Now, I didn't eat it all, right? I left a remnant for today, because that's what a remnant is. A remnant means not everything got consumed. There's still some left over. Maybe another way to think of it would be to think of like a survivor, right? There's the TV show where you get 30 people and they all start out on an island and they vote each other off, and eventually you get down to a select few. They're the remnant. They're the ones who are left, the ones who have survived. And so when God talks about a remnant, he is talking about it in terms of it's not everybody, it's just a small group. But I want you to understand this, because this is really critical to understanding who God is. God is a God that saves a remnant. In fact, this is true throughout history, is that God has been all about saving a remnant. Of course, the first example of that is Noah, right? All of humanity is terrible. And we're destroying ourselves. In order to keep us from destroying ourselves, God destroys most, but he saves a remnant. And so I want you to understand that when we talk about God saving a remnant, this is encouraging, because it means that no matter how bad things get, all will not be lost. No matter how bad it is, all will not be lost. And so when we talk about Israel as God's people, we need to understand that one of the foundational truths about God's relationship with Israel is that he always saves a remnant. So that no matter how bad it may get for Israel, they know that all will never be lost. This goes all the way back to the book of Genesis. There's a story of Joseph. We know about his coat. But the story is much darker than that. His brothers capture him and sell him into slavery. He's shipped off to Egypt all by himself and thinks he'll never see his family again. But God works miraculously, brings him through a series of events until he finds himself as a high position in the land. And then a famine comes, and Joseph's brothers come to Egypt looking for food. And lo and behold, the person who gives them the food is Joseph. And of course, they're terrified because they know what they did to him. They think he's going to kill him. And he reminds them, hey guys, look, I'm not mad. I've forgiven you. I know what you meant for evil, God meant for good. And then he says, God sent me to Egypt so that he could preserve a remnant. This is core in how the nation of Israel understands himself in the Old Testament, because they understand that God has moved over and over in history to preserve a remnant. Many years later, King Hezekiah is on the walls of Jerusalem, and he looks out and he sees the armies of Assyria, the strongest army in the world, and he fears all is lost, and so he calls the prophet Isaiah, and Isaiah comes to him and he comforts him with the words that God will preserve a remnant, because that's who God is. This is encouraging, because no matter how dark it gets for Israel, God still has a plan for them. Let me show you how this plays out in the New Testament. Romans chapter 11. Paul is writing to the church in Rome. So he's talking to Christians some are Jewish and some are Gentiles. And this is what he says. Lest you be wise in your own sight, I do not want you to be unaware of this mystery, brothers. Now, Paul, in a lot of his writing, talks about mysteries. And usually when he says, here's a mystery, what he's talking about is something that wasn't known before, but we know it now. It usually has to do with Jesus. Like, before Jesus, we didn't know this, but now we understand it much better. That's what he's doing here. He says, let me explain this mystery to you. He says, a partial hardening has come upon Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. And in this way, all Israel will be saved. Let me take time out for a second. I'm gonna kind of nerd out on you theologically. So if this goes a little deeper than you like, if there's too much nuance, that's okay. You can check out for a minute, take a nap, play on your phone. I don't care. I'll call you back when I'm done, all right? So when Paul says all Israel will be saved, he's referencing back to everything he's talked about up to that point in Romans chapter 9 through 11. Now, if you sit down and read Romans 9 through 11 this afternoon, you're going to discover it is some of the heaviest, most difficult, deepest reading in the Bible. Just some really, there's just a lot of stuff that Paul is kind of unpacking in these chapters. But the main theme that he's talking about in this chapter is this idea that God still has a plan for Israel. And he wants the people in Rome to understand that God still has a plan for Israel, and God's good plan for Israel is actually a good plan for the world. However, he also points out to them that when he talks about all Israel, it doesn't actually mean all Israel. Here's what I mean. Paul identifies that there's this idea called national Israel, and there's an idea that we'll call covenantal Israel. So national Israel is kind of all-encompassing. It's everybody who's a part of the Jewish nation. That's national Israel. But within that group, there's what Paul calls covenantal Israel. That's the people who believe in God. This isn't a new thing. It goes all the way back to the beginning of the nation. Remember back in Exodus, God frees the people from slavery in Egypt. 10 plagues come down. Pharaoh finally says, fine, you guys can go. Just get out of here. They get out. Red Sea parts. They walk across on dry ground. God sends 10 commandments down at Mount Sinai, and then miracle after miracle after miracle in the wilderness. And in spite of all of that, there are people in the camp, people who were slaves in Egypt, got freed by God, walked across the Red Sea, saw the 10 commandments, saw the miracles. They saw all of that, and they still didn't believe. One of them is a man named Korah, who leads a rebellion against Moses and against God. And he's a demonstration that there are some people who have seen it all and still choose not to believe. And so Paul says they're national Israel, but they're not covenantal Israel. And so when he gets to chapter 11 and he says all Israel will be saved, what he's pointing out is it's not every single person who has ever lived, who has ever been Jewish, but simply it's the covenantal people of Israel. That's who all Israel is, okay? All right, if you checked out, come back now. We're done. And we're going to get back to what we're talking about, because I want you to see the first part of this mystery where Paul says Israel has for this time experienced kind of a hardness of heart. What he's saying is Israel right now is disconnected from God. We actually saw a prophecy of this a few weeks ago when we were in the book of Hosea. And Hosea prophesied that the time would come when God would say to Israel, you are not my children, you are not my people, right? That's pretty frightening words. But then Hosea later says, but then the time will come when God will gather them back and say, you are my people, you are my children. And Paul in Romans is writing in that in-between time. It says this time has come when there's a hardness of heart in Israel, when God has said, not my people, not my children. And this will last until the fullness of the times of the Gentiles. All right, so until means it is going to end. And so there's this period of time that we're talking about where Israel's hearts are hardened towards God, they're disconnected toward God, and God is working with the Gentiles to do something new, something different with them. Now, Jesus also talked about this. If you go to Luke chapter 21, Jesus talked about this. His disciples came to him and said, Jesus, tell us, how is everything going to end? When is the end going to come? And what are the signs we should be looking for? And so in Luke 21, Jesus preaches this whole sermon about the end times. I'm just going to pick it up in verse 20. Jesus says, but when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation has come near. Now, the disciples didn't know this, but we do, because we can look back. Jesus is actually predicting something that will happen in most of their lifetime. In 70 AD, the Roman armies came and completely destroyed Jerusalem, burned it to the ground, pulled every stone down from the walls. It was completely desolate. And Jesus says, look, when that happens, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. They did that. And let those who are inside the city depart, and let those who are out in the country enter it, for these are the days of vengeance to fulfill all that is written. So Jesus said, look, if you're out in the country, don't try to be safe in the city, because all those people who went into the city, they all died. And they died horrible, awful deaths. To help us understand how awful those times were, Jesus says, alas for women who are pregnant and for those who are nursing infants in those days. For there will be great distress upon the earth and wrath against this people. They will fall by the edge of the sword and be led captive among the nations. So Jesus is actually predicting that in 70 AD, Jerusalem will be destroyed. He uses the word desolate. It will be destroyed. And then he says, and all of the people will be scattered. They will be led captive where? To other nations, to other places around the world. Now, do you understand that in 70 AD, this all happened, and from that point on, for thousands of years, there was no nation of Israel. The people of Israel were scattered to the nations exactly as Jesus predicted they would be. And then Jesus says, and Jerusalem will be trampled underfoot by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. So that last phrase Jesus uses is the same phrase that Paul used, talking about these times of the Gentiles being fulfilled. And what Jesus is saying is the same thing that Paul was saying, is that until this happens, until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled, Israel will have this hardness of heart towards God. They will be disconnected with God. But then something is going to change. And what we know by looking at some of the other prophets, like Daniel, what we understand by reading Revelation, is that at the end of the times of the Gentiles, God will begin working again with his people to soften their hearts, to draw them close to him. And this will be a very short period of time, probably like 7 years, in which God will bring his people back to himself. And this will be a time unlike any other time in human history. It will be a time of greater famine, time of greater war, more death, more destruction, more devastation, more natural disasters, all designed to bring God's people back to him. And at the end of all of it, the world will turn against the Jewish people. They will march on Jerusalem again, but this time, King Jesus will save them. And that will mark the end of all things when the final judgments begin. And Jesus sets up his ultimate kingdom in Jerusalem. I want you to understand, something happened in 1948 that made Jesus' predictions all the more likely. Jesus said, Jerusalem will be trampled underfoot by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. And right up until 1948, that was happening. Right? You look back at the history of the last 2,000 years after Rome destroyed Jerusalem, and nation after nation has come in and taken control of Jerusalem. Remember the Crusades and all of that. But then in 1948, in the aftermath of World War II and the aftermath of the Holocaust, the world decided we need to give the Jewish people their state. And so the nation of Israel was reborn. And Jerusalem, for the first time in 2,000 years, was under control of the Jewish people. And here's what that means today. Jerusalem is not being trampled by the Gentiles as much. Because it still is a little bit. But what that means is we're this close to the times of the Gentiles being fulfilled. And the reality is, with modern technology, and the missionary movement of the last 300 years, the gospel has now gone to every tribe, every tongue, every nation. And so there is nothing now holding back the times of the Gentiles from being fulfilled. And God's saying, I am turning my attention back to my people to draw them back to myself, and the end of times happening. And all that being true means that when we talk about God's remnant, it's encouraging because we know that all will not be lost, but it's also challenging because it means that all will not be saved. Because at the end of the fulfillment of the times of the Gentiles, God will save a remnant of the Gentiles, but not all. And so this morning, the most important question for all of us to ask and for me to answer is, how do I be a part of God's remnant?